Today we're going to be talking about the most iconic WWE matches from my childhood. If you guys don't know who I am, my name is Walt Michaels. I am a aspiring professional wrestler. I have been training for a couple months now. I've been nursing a shoulder injury a little bit right now, so I haven't been at practice for the past couple weeks, but I will be returning here pretty soon. But I think it would be pretty cool to make a little video reminiscing on some of my favorite matches growing up. I was a very, very big WWE fan. I would say from the years, 2006, 7, was when I first was getting into it. And then I kind of, stopped watching around 2010, 2011, and kind of got into some different hobbies, mainly football. And didn't really, get back into professional wrestling up until, about a year ago when I started looking into training to becoming one myself. So I thought it'd be pretty cool to look back at some of the most iconic matches from when I was growing up and which ones stuck out to me the most. Now, these aren't necessarily the best wrestling matches from my childhood. Not all of these are, the best matches out there, but there's a lot of iconic moments throughout, and figured gives me a nice excuse to go back and watch all of them, and we can discuss all of the highlights and iconic moments from each match. So let's get started. First up, we got WrestleMania 23, the Money in the Bank ladder match. This was won by Mr. Kennedy. The other participants in this match were Edge, Booker T, Randy Orton, Jeff Hardy, Matt Hardy, CM Punk, and Finlay. Now this is a very, very stacked match right here. All of the names are pretty well known in the industry. There really isn't anybody that's, useless for the match, which I would say in most years' Money of the Banks, there's at least one or two guys where I don't really know or care about them at all, and I don't think there's like any realistic shot of them winning. Versus this one, even though there's a couple of them that I feel like didn't really make sense if they won, like Finlay didn't really make sense. I was still a big Finlay fan growing up. I went to some live shows and he was always at them, and he was always one of my favorite performers for sure. Outside of that, there is a couple of guys that you will notice will be very repetitive on this list. CM Punk makes a couple appearances. Randy Orton is on here quite a bit. Jeff Hardy also makes quite a few appearances as well. As for important moments in the match, I'd say the first part that really stuck out to me was Jeff Hardy doing the leg drop through the ladder to, I believe it was Edge, from the top of the taller ladder inside of the ring. That spot just looked incredible. Growing up, it's like, that's an insane drop. And I don't know, it's scripted and everything, but you can't fake that jump and that fall and going through the ladder, so that was painful. That took a lot. That's a lot of courage to actually jump and perform that spot. It looks a lot easier than it actually is to do it. Once you're actually up there on top of that ladder and have to jump 12 feet down to the ground, that's a pretty terrifying thing to do. So, props to these guys that pull off these crazy moves and stunts. I'd say, later on in the match when Hornswoggle enters and he tries to climb the ladder and tries to get it, that's a pretty entertaining moment. I'd say the last thing that I kind of noticed on my rewatch of it is that at the ending sequence, the ref actually puts the ladder in that Mr. Kennedy uses at the end to win. So none of that really happens without the ref putting the ladder in the ring for him, which is something, I definitely never noticed that as a kid, and it's something that probably never really thought about until I started taking, actual professional wrestling classes. So that's kind of cool, a little behind the scenes kind of stuff like that. All right, moving on next, we have Backlash 2007. Just a note too, these aren't any ranking, I'm just doing them in chronological order. So we got Backlash 2007, WWE Championship Fatal 4-Way match between John Cena, Shawn Michaels, Edge, and Randy Orton. Now, this one was definitely one that I had to include on this list. This one is a personal favorite of mine for sure. Growing up, you know, I had some CDs of, I guess DVDs of many of these different pay-per-views back then. This, I believe, was one of the first DVDs that I got was Backlash 2007, and this was for sure a match that I watched endless amount of times, so I had to include it on here for sure. I would say the Shawn Michaels back moonsault earlier on in the match is definitely a pretty iconic moment. Anything off of the top ropes or ladders or anything high flying has always stuck with me, because those just always seem the most terrifying spots and moments of matches. So whenever those get performed, it's always a very big thumbs up in my eyes. Another point later on in the match, Cena's on the top rope and performs a double leg drop off the top ropes. Cena's got a really impressive leg drop, I'll give him that. I've never been a huge John Cena fan, you know. He was kind of the popular guy growing up for me during my time frame of watching, so I never hated him or anything, but he was never my personal favorite. Shawn Michaels performing his famous body slam and elbow off the top rope. He did that 3 times. That was a pretty cool sequence in the match for sure. Probably my favorite part of the match is that ending sequence. It's very, very iconic. Edge goes for the spear. Cena jumps over it. Randy Orton catches Edge, goes for an RKO, gets thrown out of the RKO, attempts another RKO, but Edge spears him once he gets thrown off of it. Cena then performs the attitude adjustment, you know, the FU back in the day, onto Edge. So now Edge and Orton are down. Shawn Michaels gets up, sweet chin music's John Cena, who falls onto Randy Orton for the 1, 2, 3 and the victory. As a kid, that was just the most insane ending. I couldn't believe it. I was absolutely shocked. It was a sight to be seen for sure. Alright, up next we have the stretcher match between Rob Van Dam and Randy Orton at One Night Stand 2007. If you can't tell, Randy Orton was definitely one of my favorite wrestlers growing up. I don't know, I always kind of rooted for the heels. I like the bad guys. So Randy Orton being one of the best bad guys growing up during, you know, my time of watching, he was obviously one of my favorites. And even though, you know, Rob Van Dam wasn't much of a heel, he was more of a baby face, I would say. He was definitely one of my favorite guys as well. You know, being from Michigan as well, that was always pretty cool to me. And he was just always real good at captivating the fans and the audience, which, you know, at home that stuck out to me whenever you could get a huge pop from the crowd and get the crowd to, you know, chant along and do stuff with you. Like, I'd say one of the first parts of the match that I really remembered was the spinning leg drop BD performed onto Orton onto the stretcher. That was huge. A little bit later on to the match, RVD tried to perform a Rolling Thunder, which Randy Orton countered into a power slam. That was really smooth. RVD missing his Somerset plancha. That was another huge spot that looked just so painful as a kid. And honestly, today, even, you know, going through classes, I imagine that was still a very painful spot without a doubt. And kind of, you know, to wrap up the match, Orton with the post-match attack. That really just kind of stuck out and kind of, you know, solidified him as a heel in my eyes as a kid, you know. Obviously, he was pretty established as a heel at this point, but as a kid, just seeing him attack, you know, a guy that I liked as a wrestler, kind of, you know, it made me see why some people hated him, but it kind of made me like him even more, to be honest. Alright, next we have the WWE Championship match from Backlash 2008. I noticed that Backlash makes a lot of appearances on this list, funny enough. And the match that we are talking about is Triple H, John Cena, Randy Orton, JBL. Now there's a couple cool moments in this match that really stuck out to me. I'd say the Orton and JBL tap out sequence where, you know, they're kind of mocking each other only to, you know, get put into a submission hold themselves. Eventually, JBL helps Randy Orton get out of his, but Randy Orton then goes and mocks JBL instead of helping him. You know, that was just a really great sequence in the match. Especially as a kid, that really stuck out for me. That was one of my favorites for sure. I was also a massive fan of the quick JBL tap out, and then immediately John Cena gets punt kicked into an elimination. And then just shout out to Triple H and Randy Orton that was about 10 minutes into the match that the JBL Cena eliminations happened, and they go on for about another 15 to 20 minutes and put on an absolute banger of a match. Well, pretty much the entire length of the remaining match was great. Some of the moments that mainly stuck out to me was the pile driver reversal onto the steps. That looked deadly. And then at the end of the match when they did the reversal finishers a couple times around before the finish, before Triple H finally pins Randy Orton, that was definitely something that stuck out to me and makes it a great watch even to this day. Next, we have Royal Rumble 2008. Not going to talk about everybody in the match, just going to talk about a couple different things and a couple different participants that really stuck out and were memorable to me as a child. Obviously, an iconic starting two with Shawn Michaels and Undertaker. Spoiler, you will be seeing them later on in the list. You guys already know which ones I'm talking about. I did enjoy the first couple entrances with the Santino spot, him coming in and getting out pretty quickly. The Great Khali spot was fine. I'm glad he wasn't in there for too long. I think having Undertaker eliminate him was a really solid choice. A little bit later on, shout out to John Morrison. I almost included him a couple times in this list, but didn't end up getting him anywhere besides for here. He was definitely one of my favorite mid-card talents. I think he wasn't utilized to the full potential by the WWE for sure. I feel like he could have been a top star, but it never really happened. But he will for sure always be one of my favorite mid-card talents of that time. One of the biggest moments of the actual match itself that stuck out to me was the very quick sequence of Undertaker eliminating Snitsky, which then Shawn Michaels Sweet Chin Music's Undertaker to eliminate him, and then Mr. Kennedy, who made an appearance earlier on in the list, comes behind Shawn Michaels and eliminates him, which leads to a pretty brutal attack from Undertaker onto Snitsky, putting him through the announcer table. The final two entrants of the match, being Triple H and John Cena, both received such a massive pop from the crowd that obviously stuck with me as a kid. Anytime you hear the crowd just go absolutely ballistic for a kick out, a finisher, or, you know, in this case, Royal Rumble entrances, that's always going to be massive and it's going to stick with me for sure. And, you know, even though I wasn't a massive John Cena fan, I think him winning the Royal Rumble was still a pretty good decision, and I still liked it back as a kid. I didn't hate it at all, and it led to a pretty good WrestleMania, I would say. Alright, moving on to WrestleMania 23, we have the career-threatening match between Ric Flair and Shawn Michaels. This one obviously has a ton of moments that stick out for being iconic. We'll get to the most famous one at the end for sure. But I'd say the first part that really sticks out is Shawn Michaels hesitates on a Sweet Chin Music, and that gets just a massive pop from the crowd. So that's kind of the first moment that really stuck out with me. A little bit later on in the match, Shawn Michaels connects with a Sweet Chin Music. Looks like it might be over, goes for the cover, and then Ric Flair kicks out after two. The pop after that was insane. This was a very, very electric crowd for this match, for sure. A little bit later on, Shawn Michaels connects with the Sweet Chin Music out of nowhere. Anytime that you can hit a finisher very spontaneously, it very much excites the crowd and gets them going. And, you know, perhaps one of the most famous lines in the history of this industry, "I'm sorry, I love you," right before delivering the career-ending Sweet Chin Music to Ric Flair, even though, you know, he may or may not have, you know, done some stuff after this match in the wrestling industry. That's not really the point. as a kid, thinking this is the end of Ric Flair, even though all I knew of Ric Flair was, the really old Ric Flair. I wasn't alive for, most of his greatness. And, even later on into his career, I missed a good portion of it, But even then, I still had a great amount of respect for Ric Flair and all of the things that he did. It was apparent throughout all of my childhood that he was obviously a GOAT of this industry. Up next, we have SummerSlam 2008. Hell in the Cell match between Edge and Undertaker. I'd say pretty quick about this one. This was definitely a good match, but it's not as iconic to me as some of the other ones on this list, but it definitely did stick out. Undertaker is obviously one of the best of all time, and Edge was definitely one of my favorites growing up as well. So, two of my favorite wrestlers performing in a pretty vicious match type. Hell in the Cell wasn't, one of my favorites necessarily, but there was definitely some banger Hell in the Cell matches, Mick Foley versus Undertaker, even though I wasn't alive when that actually happened, I definitely watched that many times throughout the years. And that's a match that just stands the test of time, It will always be an iconic match, no matter what. Anyway, back to this actual match. I'd say the first part that really just stuck out to me on the rewatch was when Undertaker sent Edge through 2 tables. That was insane. That was a pretty huge spot. Anytime you got tables involved, that always got me pretty hyped as a kid. I loved the "We want tables." That was always one of my favorite chants, without a doubt. And then obviously you have to talk about the post-match choke slam through the ring. That's extremely iconic. Also, a side note, I loved the stage for SummerSlam 2008. Definitely one of my favorite sets of all time. Remember earlier when I mentioned Undertaker and Shawn Michaels? Well, here they are. WrestleMania 25. This one is potentially one of my favorites of all time. This is definitely at least in my top 4 when it comes to this list, if I had to actually rank them. There are a ton of crazy moments in this match, and even though they're both older at this point, neither of them are technically in their primes of their wrestling careers. They're just such good veterans, such good wrestlers. There's a reason that they're Hall of Famers, and they're going to go down as some of the best wrestlers of multiple generations. Starting off, the missed moonsault to the outside of the ring by Shawn Michaels. That's just got to be so terrifying to just know you're taking a backflip just straight to the ground. That's a long way from the top of the turnbuckle. I've been on top of the turnbuckle, and I'm assuming the rings I've been in probably aren't even as tall as WWE rings. So to do a backflip off of that, knowing you have to just land on the ground, that's a terrifying thing to do, and to just be able to do it and full send it, that's very impressive. A little bit later on in the match, Undertaker's about to do a jump over the top rope into Shawn Michaels, but Shawn Michaels pulls the cameraman, and the camera shot of the cameraman, getting hit with the camera going up afterwards, that was always pretty iconic as a kid. I love that shot. For sure. Throughout this match, obviously this being a very long match, there were several false finishes with choke slams and sweet chin musics, all of them just receiving massive pops because everybody is, in anticipation of Undertaker and his streak, and Shawn Michaels really feels like somebody that has a legitimate shot to beat the streak. When, not saying that people beforehand didn't feel like they have a shot, but this was the first time for me that I got to really witness the streak live and get to see if it actually had a shot at being beaten. Because, obviously watching past WrestleMania matches of him, I know the streak is active. I know he's going to win. But when you're watching him live, you didn't know that at the time. So they were super exciting. Every time you had a sweet chin music and he kicked out just before the 3 count. Moving on to the Undertaker trying to perform a last ride that gets countered by Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels attempts to roll him up for the pin, but Undertaker doesn't budge, picks him up, and puts him into the last ride anyway. Shawn Michaels goes to skin the cat, but then Undertaker catches him for the tombstone. And then the kick out for that was just such an insane pop from the crowd. And then the finish of that match was just so excellent. The moonsault catch into the tombstone for the finish. It was a beautiful match. Definitely one of the best of all time, in my opinion. Alright, moving on to Extreme Rules 2009. We have the World Heavyweight Championship ladder match between Jeff Hardy and Edge. I'd say the first part that really stuck out to me was when Jeff Hardy did the drop kick to the ladder. That always seemed so painful. As a kid, I always thought anything with weapons was just, those were always so devastating as a kid. Hearing the loud impacts and thuds and breaking through things, like, how could that not seem painful, you know, especially as a child? After that, we have a very, very tall ladder, Whisper in the Wind from Jeff Hardy. That was insane. Anything, like I've mentioned multiple times, anything off of those ladders, you get my respect for those moves. Those are some courageous moves to be pulling off for sure. I'm definitely nowhere near ready to be pulling off anything like that. And then finally, both of them crashing through the ladder at ringside. Anytime you have a dual bump like that, where you're both breaking through and both taking impacts, that always just stuck out to me as a kid. You know, both of these competitors are, you know, putting their bodies and lives on the line, and, you know, they're going for it. And it's something that was always super iconic for me. Any of those high impact bumps and spots, those, you know, obviously stuck out with me as a kid and still stick out to me this day. And then obviously we can't talk about this match without talking about the CM Punk Money in the Bank cash-in immediately after, and then Punk becomes the World Heavyweight Champion. This also leads us directly into our next match at SummerSlam 2009. Jeff Hardy versus CM Punk in a TLC match for the World Heavyweight Championship. I would say the first part that really stuck out to me is Jeff Hardy sets CM Punk up on the table and goes for a frog splash, but at the last second, CM Punk slips off of the table and sends Jeff Hardy through the table. A little bit later on in the match, while doing a stunt off of the ladder, Jeff Hardy performs a power bomb on CM Punk. Any power bombs off of the ladders, those were always pretty impressive to me. Those always stuck out for me. And then Jeff Hardy gets the high knee in the corner from CM Punk, and he's trying to do his, you know, his famous bulldog takeover move, but Jeff Hardy is able to lift him up out and over the ring into the table. That's a huge spot that got a huge pop from the crowd. And then obviously you can't talk about this match without the high ladder swanton bomb through the announcer table. That was potentially one of the craziest Jeff Hardy things I've seen, you know, outside of his, you know, earlier days where, you know, he had the TLC matches, you know, with the Dudley Boys, Edge and Christian. Those had some crazy spots. I forget exactly what event it was, but I remember Jeff Hardy climbed on the top of a stage and did a swanton bomb off of there. Jeff Hardy was definitely known for his high-flying stunts, and that's definitely why he was one of my favorites of the times, without a doubt. And then obviously post-match, after CM Punk wins, lights go out, Undertaker's music hits, lights come back on, Undertaker's in the ring, choke slam CM Punk. Undertaker's obviously one of my favorites, if you couldn't tell. He makes a lot of appearances in this list, and how could he not? He's the dead man. He's the GOAT. Alright, and to wrap up this list is probably the final live event that I watched as like a hardcore wrestling fan as a kid. This is WrestleMania 26, Shawn Michaels Undertaker streak versus career. You guys know it had to end on this one, right? They get off to a crazy, speedy, fast, intense start, which A lot of the times I feel like you don't see that a ton. A lot of matches, start off a little more methodical, especially when, you're going to be putting on a 30-minute show here at WrestleMania. You don't want to get too tired too quickly, but I think, both wrestlers know the scope of the match and realize its importance and know that they want to put on one of the best matches of all time. And I definitely think that they accomplished that goal. Going through the announcer table a little bit later on in the match was a huge spot. The sweet chin music, false finishes, Undertaker kicking out at the last second. As a kid, I 100% thought Shawn Michaels was going to win this match because there's no way Shawn Michaels is retiring. They didn't let him get it last year at last year's WrestleMania, so I figured this is the year that Shawn Michaels beats The Undertaker and the streak is over. Then there was a couple different, moments where, I was starting to question it. Undertaker hits a tombstone and then Shawn Michaels kicks out. So that gave me a little bit of hope. But, Shawn Michaels gets up, taunts Undertaker, and then Undertaker hits potentially the most vicious tombstone pile driver I have ever seen in my life. The jumping tombstone pile driver he delivered on him just looked like it was filled with rage and anger and was the perfect ending to this match. And then obviously we can't not talk about the post-match handshake and standing ovation for the legend that is the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels. Alright, so those were some of the most iconic matches of WWE of my childhood. If you guys agree or have any matches that you think that I left out, be sure to leave them in the comments, like this video, and subscribe for more wrestling content. Thank you for watching. Peace.